Today, we look at the top 10 most valuable Marvel comics of the year 1961. To many, 1961 is the beginning of the Silver Age of comics for Marvel Comics as they debut their very first true superhero title, which we're going to see a little bit later in our countdown. Jumping in the top 10 most valuable iconic books of the year, Tales to Astonish, number 15. This issue is a prototype issue of Electro. This is something that was common for Stan Lee. He created a lot of different ideas for characters and monsters, and then he would use them again later to relaunch new superheroes once he got going with all his superhero titles. That's the case with this issue. This is a Jack Kirby monster cover featuring The Blip. We also have Steve Ditko interior artwork on this issue. This is the first issue of the series put out by Marvel under the name Marvel, as opposed to Atlas Comics, which they had been using for the last decade. It's the number 10 book of the year for Marvel and ranks 142nd most valuable Marvel comic of the 1960s. On the census, you can see there's still very few copies graded. In total, 89 copies. There are 8 super high-grade copies grading 9.0 or better. Heritage Auctions has sold only 27 copies of this book in the last 2 decades. 10-cent cover price, comics code. Using the Overstreet Price Guide Annual, we can see the growth in all conditions from low grade to high grade for raw copies. And we can see the book has not quite doubled in the last 15 years in low grade, but the book has gone up about 2.5 times in higher grades for raw copies. On the CGC census, there are 2 9.4s and 3 9.2s ranking as the highest graded copies in existence. The number 9 book of the year is Tales to Astonish, number 21. This is another prototype issue. This is a prototype of the Hulk, and it's the first of 3 different Hulk prototype comics from writer Stan Lee. This book also features Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby art, ranks 9th of the year and 140th of the decade. There are 83 copies graded. There are no high-grade copies of this on the CGC census, and Heritage Auctions has sold 21 copies, which is basically 1 copy a year. In the Overstreet Price Guide, we can see this book has doubled in lower grades and is more than tripled in high grades over this time period. And on the census, the highest graded copies are 8.5s. There are 4 of them on the census. Number 8 of the year is Tales of Suspense, number 16. This is another prototype issue. It's the first of 4 different Iron Man prototype issues from Stan Lee. It's also the first Metallo story. This issue features Jack Kirby cover art. There's also Don Heck and Dick Ayers interior art on this book. Ranks 135th of the decade. Demand definitely growing on this book. There are now 100 copies on the census. And there are 6 high-grade copies of this book, and Heritage has sold 28 of these. And look at the kind of the whitish background. This will be tough to find in high grade for sure. On the census, the book has almost doubled in lower grades. High grades, it has exactly doubled in the last 9 years on this census here. It's now a $1,700 book. And amazingly, there is a 9.6 of this book existing and also a 9.2. Number 7 of the year is Tales of Suspense, number 14. This is the first appearance of the Colossus, a giant monster who would appear more than once. Jack Kirby did the cover artwork. We have Dick Ayers and Steve Ditko interior artwork. Print run estimated at 184,000 copies, which was on the high end for Marvel titles at this time period. Ranks 127th of the decade. On the census, we have 77 copies graded, 5 high-grade copies, and Heritage again has sold 20 copies. In the Overstreet Price Guide, the book has almost doubled in lower grades, and on the census, it's almost tripled. It's now a $1,700 book. On the census, there's a 9.4 and a 9.2 of this book. Ranking number 6 of the year, most valuable and important comic, is Journey into Mystery, number 66. This is another Hulk prototype, and look at the cover heading, The Return of the Hulk, Journey into Mystery 66. This is Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko cover, and it's got Zemnu the Titan, act of the Hulk in this issue, ranks 117th of the decade. On the census, there are 140 copies graded, but only one high-grade copy, 32 sold by Heritage. In the Overstreet Price Guide, a little more demand for this book. It has more than doubled in lower grades, and it's gone up about 2.5 times in high grades raw. On the census, the highest grade copy is a 9.0, and there are also 3 8.5s. Number 5 of the year, Journey into the Mystery 73. This is a Spider-Man prototype issue, the first of 2 that Stanley would create. And look at this. Here we have The Spider Strikes on issue 73. And this, some people call this the reverse prototype, as it features a spider that's accidentally exposed to radiation. We've got Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko working on this book. It ranks 105th of the decade. In the census, there are 137 copies, but only 3 high grade. Heritage has auctioned off 24 copies. And in the Overstreet Price Guide, this has been a key for a long time, but yet the book has not even doubled in this long time period I'm showing here. It is now a $1,900 book, so the book has tripled in high grades in this time period. On the census, we have 3 9.0s ranking the highest of this book. Next is a big surprise. This book has only become a key in the last decade. Linda Carter, Student Nurse #1. This was one of a few teen-oriented genre books that Stanley and Marvel released in the early 60s. Usually not that highly collected, but Linda would later become Night Nurse and would become part of the Marvel superhero universe in Daredevil 58 in 2004, therefore driving prices way up on this teen book. It's got Al Hartley cover and art. Stanley is the writer of this book. It ranks 4th of the year, 80th of the decade, 37 copies graded, only 1 high grade copy. Heritage has only sold 12 of these ever. White cream background cover, very tough to find in high grade. In the Overstreet Price Guide of the last few years, you can see it's got nice steady movement, and it's now up to $2,600 for a 9.2 raw. There's a 9.2 and an 8.5 on the census. Number 3 book of the year is another #1 issue. Marvel only released a few new titles this year, and they're both appearing on this list. Amazing Adventures #1 has the first appearance and origin of Dr. Droom, who's considered the first Marvel Age hero, though you could debate that's not true anymore now that Groot has become popular and came out the year earlier. We have a tour appearance and a backup story featuring Steve Ditko art. Monster cover art by Jack Kirby. Print run estimated 125,000 copies. Number 3 of the year and 59 of the decade. On the census, there are a lot more copies graded of this one, 234, with only 5 high-grade copies of this yellow background cover. Heritage has sold a whopping 70 copies of this book, always in demand. In the Overstreet Price Guide, again, nice, slow, steady growth in all grades, and it is now officially a $4,000 book in 9.2 for raw copies. On the census, there are 5 copies graded 9.0. The number 2 book of the year, this is an iconic big book, Strange Tales 89, the first appearance of the monster Fing Fang Foom, possibly the most popular horror monster from Marvel until, again, Groot became popular in recent years. This is a Jack Kirby cover and title story, and Steve Ditko also some artwork. Print run estimated 136,000 copies. It's ranking 2 of the year and 28 of the decade. Quite a big book. 378 copies graded by CGC with only 3 high-grade copies. Heritage has sold 55 of these. On the census, huge growth. You can see the book really started to take off around 2015, and then it's just been moving continually. The past year, however, you can see there's actually hesitance, and now the price has finally stalled in lower grades. But over the last 13 years, you can see this book has gone up about 8 times its price, which is a huge, massive jump. And in high grades, it's an $8,600 book, and that means it's gone up almost 10 times in price for the 9.2 raw copies. On the census, there are 3 9.0s. That brings us to the #1 comic of 1961 for Marvel Comics. And of course, it is Fantastic Four #1, officially the first Marvel Silver Age superhero comic. the first appearance and origin of the Fantastic Four, Marvel's first superhero team, origin and first appearance of Mole Man as well. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby working on this book. And the company even switches their name from Atlas to Marvel at this time. This is considered the first official Silver Age Marvel Comics book. This is a major iconic book. Print run estimated at 125,000 copies. It's the #1 comic of the year and #3 most valuable Marvel comic of the entire 1960s. On the census, demand is crazy high, 1,750 copies graded, 2 copies grading 9.6 or higher. And Heritage has sold 418 copies of this iconic cover with a white background, making it very hard to find high-grade copies. Classic cover that's been paid tribute to dozens and dozens of times over the year, featuring first appearances of The Thing, Mr. Fantastic, Human Torch, and Invisible Girl. This is the book that made everyone a Marvel collector back in the 60s, and now 60 years later, it's still the iconic book. We have complete growth here from the very first Overstreet price guide in 1970, where a low-grade copy was worth $20, and now you're paying $4,600 for a low-grade copy. Growth has been fairly steady over the years. It's had a few dips. It was actually priced higher in 1995 than it was in 2007, so it took 12 years to recover because it was a very pricey book in low grade in the early 2000s. But now those prices seem like a deal because it just keeps moving up. In higher grades, you can see in the very first price guide in 1970, this was a $30 book. It was the most valuable Marvel comic, and now it still ranks 3rd. And now it is $210,000 for a 9.2 raw copy, and that's if you ever find one, which you probably won't. And on the census, there are 2 9.6s, 3 9.4s, and 2 9.2s. Now, what we're going to do next here quickly is we're going to compare all these books and actually look at them on the CGC census just to see which ones have got the most copies graded. And of course, Fantastic Four #1 is the winner by far, 1,750 copies graded. Next after that is Strange Tales 89 with 378 and Amazing Adventures 1 with 234. But after that, the numbers drop significantly. Linda Carter Student Nurse only has 37 copies graded. And that's all grades combined. On the high end of the census, we see that Tales of Suspense 16 and Fantastic Four #1 both have 9.6s. And of course, the one with the least high grade copies, again, has to be Linda Carter because there's so few copies on the census. There you go. The first official year of the Silver Age for Marvel Comics, led by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko. And we do this series every week, so please subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.